Commander Jacob Hayes stood in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council Station and felt the weight of billions of human lives pressing down on his shoulders. The chamber was massive, built to accommodate species of all shapes and sizes, and the ceiling stretched so high above that it disappeared into artificial clouds. 12 platforms surrounded the central speaking area where Jacob stood, each one holding a representative from the ancient species that ruled known space. The air smelled strange, filtered and recycled through systems designed for a dozen different atmospheric preferences, and Jacob could feel his heart beating faster than normal in the slightly reduced gravity. He had prepared for this meeting for months. Every word of his speech had been carefully chosen, reviewed by the best diplomats Earth had to offer, and practiced until he could deliver it perfectly. This was supposed to be a routine session, a chance for humanity to present its case for expanded trading rights and perhaps even a seat on one of the lesser councils. Instead, the moment Jacob and his delegation had arrived, they had been informed that the session topic had changed. The council would be voting on the human question. Whatever that meant. Captain Lisa Morgan stood 3 steps behind Jacob, her uniform crisp and her expression neutral, but he could see the tension in her jaw. She had been with him through every negotiation over the past 5 years, and she knew as well as he did that something was wrong. The other members of their delegation, all experienced diplomats and military officers, waited in the observation area above, watching through the transparent floor as the drama unfolded below. The Thren representative rose from his platform. His species looked like someone had taken a lizard and stretched it into a humanoid shape, all scales and cold eyes and a mouth full of too many teeth. His name was something unpronounceable in human languages, so everyone just called him Speaker Zeth. He had never liked humans. That much was clear from their previous encounters, and now he held a data tablet in his clawed hands that glowed with what Jacob assumed was evidence of some kind. Speaker Zeth began to talk, his voice translated into English by the small device in Jacob's ear. The Thren accused humanity of aggressive expansion, of violating the spirit of galactic law even if not the letter, of colonizing worlds too quickly and claiming resources that should be shared. He painted a picture of humans as dangerous newcomers who refused to respect the established order, who pushed boundaries and asked too many questions and developed technology at a pace that made older species uncomfortable. With each accusation, Jacob felt his stomach sink lower. When Speaker Zeth finished, Jacob was given a chance to respond. He stepped forward to the center of the chamber and began his defense. He talked about how humanity had followed every treaty, respected every border, and paid every fee and tax required by council law. He pointed out that human colonies were established only on worlds that had been surveyed and approved, that human ships stayed in designated lanes, that human traders operated within all legal frameworks. He spoke about the contributions humanity had made to galactic culture, the art and music and literature that humans had shared freely, the medical advances that had saved lives across multiple species. Lisa stepped forward when Jacob gestured to her and added her own testimony. She spoke of her years commanding vessels in council space, of the friendships she had made with other species, of the mutual respect and cooperation she had witnessed. Her voice was steady and passionate, and for a moment, Jacob thought they might actually have a chance. But then the voting began. One by one, the council members indicated their positions. The Thren voted against humanity as expected. Then the Vaxil, an ancient species that looked like floating jellyfish, voted the same way. The Korthan followed, then the Belix, then the Yearn. Jacob watched in growing horror as species after species voted to support the Thren position. Only 2 species abstained, and none voted in humanity's favor. The verdict was announced by the Council Prime, a being so old that nobody even remembered what its species was originally called. Humanity was declared a destabilizing influence on galactic order. All human vessels, stations, and colonies beyond a designated zone would be required to evacuate within 30 standard days. The zone itself was tiny, barely large enough to contain 7 habitable worlds, most of them the ones humanity had settled first when they achieved faster than light travel. Everything else, 17 thriving colonies and dozens of stations and outposts, would have to be abandoned. The council chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien sounds, some of celebration, some of what might have been protest, but most just of indifference. Jacob stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. 30 days. They had 30 days to uproot millions of people, to abandon years of work, to retreat into a box and accept banishment from the stars. Lisa grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the exit. The other delegation members were already moving, gathering their materials and preparing for the long trip back to Earth. As they walked through the corridors of the council station, they passed aliens of various species, and Jacob noticed how some looked away while others watched with what might have been pity or perhaps satisfaction. Back aboard the Horizon's Edge, their ship, Jacob finally allowed himself to sit down and put his head in his hands. Lisa stood nearby, already composing the message that would have to be sent to Earth, to Admiral Frank Coleman and the rest of the military command, to President Helen Carter and the civilian government. The news would devastate billions of people who had believed that humanity's future lay in partnership with other species, in being part of something larger than themselves. Jacob looked up at Lisa and saw his own anger reflected in her eyes. She spoke first, her voice low and hard. They had been played, she said. This was never about law or order or proper procedure. This was about fear. The older species had looked at humanity's progress and potential and decided that it was better to cage the newcomers now before they became too strong to control. The Thren had orchestrated this, gathering support over months or years, and the other council species had gone along because they always went along with whoever held power. Jacob stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the massive council station and the hundreds of ships from dozens of species docked around it. Somewhere on Earth, Admiral Coleman would be receiving their message right now, learning that everything humanity had worked for had been stripped away by political maneuvering and prejudice. But Jacob made a decision in that moment, one that he knew Coleman would support. They would evacuate as ordered, follow the council's decree, and retreat into their assigned zone. But they would not give up. They would not accept this judgment as final. He turned back to Lisa and told her to add something to the message. Tell the Admiral that the Council had made a mistake. Tell him that they had just given humanity a reason to stop playing by their rules. Tell him that 30 days from now, when the last human ship left Council space, a new era would begin. Humanity would build something better than the Council, something stronger. And someday these same species that voted to banish them would look back and realize they had created their own worst nightmare. Lisa smiled for the first time since the vote and began typing. The message would arrive on Earth in a few hours, and then the real work would begin. The 30 days became a blur of frantic activity across 17 human colonies and dozens of orbital stations. Captain Daniel Cross stood on the bridge of the transport vessel Sanctuary and watched the chaos unfold on the planet below through his viewport. New Haven had been one of the first colonies established after humanity achieved faster than light travel, and now it was being torn apart by the emergency evacuation. Ships descended and ascended in endless streams, carrying people and whatever possessions they could manage, leaving behind homes and businesses and entire lives that had been built over decades. Daniel had commanded evacuation operations before, but never anything on this scale. His job was to coordinate the fleet of transport ships that would carry settlers from the Outer Rim territories back to the designated human zone. Every hour brought new complications. Some colonists refused to leave, barricading themselves in their homes and demanding that Earth send warships to fight the Council instead of retreating. Others had too much to transport and argued about what could be taken and what had to stay. Children cried, families fought, and everywhere Daniel looked he saw the human cost of the Council's decision. On New Haven's surface, Greg Sullivan stood in the field he had spent 12 years cultivating and felt tears running down his face. His wife Kate stood beside him with their 2 children, and the 4 of them stared at the farmhouse that had been their home for most of the kids' lives. The transport shuttles were landing in the nearby town, and they had maybe 6 hours before the last one departed. Greg had been told he could bring 2 containers worth of belongings, which meant choosing between the furniture Kate's father had built, the farming equipment Greg had modified and perfected, the children's toys and books, and 1,000 other items that represented their life here. His son Danny, only 8 years old, asked why they had to leave if they hadn't done anything wrong. Greg had no good answer for that. He told the boy that sometimes powerful people made unfair decisions, and sometimes you had to go along with those decisions even when you hated them. But he also told Danny to remember this feeling, this anger and helplessness, because someday they would make sure it never happened again. Kate squeezed Greg's hand, and they turned away from the farm, walking toward the town and the uncertain future waiting in the transport ships above. Back on Earth, Admiral Frank Coleman sat in the emergency command center that had been established in Geneva and tried to process the flood of reports coming in from every corner of human space. The Admiral was a career military officer who had served for 40 years, through conflicts and peacekeeping missions and diplomatic crises, but nothing had prepared him for this. President Helen Carter stood beside him, her face pale with exhaustion as they reviewed the evacuation schedules and resource allocations. Every transport ship in human space had been pressed into service, along with cargo haulers and even some military vessels that had been retrofitted with passenger accommodations. The logistics were nightmare fuel. 17 colonies meant millions of people who needed transport, food, medical care, and somewhere to go when they arrived in the human zone. The 7 worlds in the designated area were already inhabited, and adding millions of refugees would strain every system to the breaking point. Coleman had put his best people on finding solutions, but there were no easy answers. Some evacuees would have to live in temporary orbital habitats for months or even years, while new colonies were established on the 7 permitted worlds. President Carter received a call from her chief of staff and stepped away to take it. When she returned, her expression had changed from exhausted to determined. She told Coleman that they needed to convene an emergency summit with representatives from all human governments, military leaders, and the top scientists and engineers. This crisis was also an opportunity, she said, and humanity needed to decide right now what kind of civilization they wanted to build in isolation. The summit took place 3 days later in a secure facility beneath the Swiss Alps. Leaders from Earth's major nations attended in person, while colonial representatives joined by secure video link. Coleman watched as President Carter opened the proceedings with a speech that acknowledged the pain and anger everyone felt, but also challenged them to think beyond the immediate crisis. The council had tried to put humanity in a cage, she said, but cages could be broken if you were strong enough. Chief Engineer Laura Bennett stood to present her proposal. She was young for such a senior position, only 35 years old, but she had earned her reputation through brilliant work on humanity's faster-than-light drives. Now, she unveiled something she called Project Dominion, a comprehensive plan to accelerate human technological development across every field. She showed schematics for new propulsion systems that could theoretically travel faster than anything the council species used. She outlined research into energy generation, weapon systems, artificial intelligence, and materials science. The goal was simple. Within 5 years, humanity would match or exceed the technological level of the council species, and within 10 years, they would surpass them. The presentation sparked immediate debate. Some leaders worried about the cost and whether their economies could handle such massive research and development programs. Others questioned whether humanity should focus on technology at all instead of diplomacy and trying to eventually rejoin the galactic community. Senator Nina Parker, representing the Earth Coalition government, argued that becoming obsessed with military power would turn humanity into the very thing the Council feared, an aggressive and dangerous species. But Intelligence Officer Kevin Walsh stood up with evidence that changed the conversation. He had been working with human spies embedded in Council space, and they had uncovered communications between Thren leaders and other Council species. The documents made it clear that the banishment had nothing to do with human violations of law or custom. The Thren had pushed for it because their analysts predicted that humanity would become a major power within 50 years, potentially challenging Thren dominance of council politics. Other species had supported the banishment for similar reasons, afraid of competition or simply preferring the status quo. The decision was political calculation, not justice. Walsh's revelation silenced the debate about whether humanity should focus on strength or reconciliation. The council had not acted in good faith, which meant appeasing them or trying to earn their approval back was pointless. They feared human potential, which meant the only path forward was to realize that potential and prove their fears justified. Admiral Coleman took the floor and delivered the speech that would define humanity's response to banishment. He spoke, about how every species in history faced moments that determined their future, tests that either broke them or forged them into something stronger. This was humanity's test. They could accept the role of victims forever contained and controlled by species that saw them as threats, or they could embrace their own destiny and build something better than the Council had ever created. The choice was to fade away or to rise up, and Coleman knew which option humanity would choose. The vote was unanimous. Project Dominion was approved along with supporting initiatives for military expansion, colonial development, and covert exploration beyond the quarantine zone boundaries. President Carter authorized funding that would redirect 30% of Earth's total economic output toward these goals, and colonial governments pledged similar commitments. It was the largest coordinated effort in human history, bigger than the initial push to the stars, bigger than any war or construction project or scientific endeavor that had come before. Jacob Hayes, who had returned to Earth after the Council session, accepted a new position as coordinator of colonial resettlement. His job was to make sure that the millions of displaced humans found new homes and new purposes within the quarantine zone. Lisa Morgan was promoted to captain of the Defiance, a new class of warship that was being fast-tracked through design and construction as part of Project Dominion's military component. Daniel Cross continued overseeing evacuations, working 20-hour days to bring every human home before the 30-day deadline expired. On day 29, the last transport ship departed from the farthest human colony. Greg Sullivan and his family were aboard, packed into temporary sleeping quarters with 100 other families, all their remaining possessions stored in the cargo hold below. As the ship accelerated away from New Haven, Greg looked back at the planet where he had built his life and made a silent promise that someday, somehow, humans would return. Not as refugees or supplicants, but as equals, or perhaps even as something more. Admiral Coleman stood in the command center and watched the final tally come in. Every human had been accounted for, every ship had made it back to the quarantine zone, and the evacuation was complete with 6 hours to spare. President Carter stood beside him, and they shared a moment of relief, but both knew the real work was just beginning. The Council thought they had solved their human problem by putting humanity in a box, but they had actually just given humanity a reason to become everything the Council feared. The next chapter of human history would be written in isolation, but Coleman suspected it would be read across the entire galaxy before long. 5 years had changed everything. Director Claire Nelson stood on the observation deck of the Bastion and looked out at what humanity had built in isolation. The Bastion was more than just a space station. It was a monument to human determination and ingenuity, stretching 15 kilometers from end to end and housing 2 million people who worked in manufacturing, research, military training, and administration. Construction drones swarmed around the outer sections, adding new modules and weapons platforms every day, and the shipyards nearby were launching 3 new vessels per week. Claire remembered when this had been nothing but empty space and a collection of blueprints that seemed impossible to realize. But humanity had a way of making the impossible routine when survival was at stake. Engineer Marcus Webb worked in a laboratory deep inside the Bastion, surrounded by prototype drives and power systems that would have seemed like magic to the Council species. His team had cracked the problem that had stumped human scientists for decades, finding a way to fold space more efficiently than conventional faster-than-light drives. The new system could move a ship twice as fast as anything the Thren used, and it used less energy doing it. Marcus was exhausted from months of 18-hour days, but the breakthrough had been worth every sleepless night. When he demonstrated the drive to Admiral Coleman and President Carter, both of them had understood immediately what it meant. Humanity now had a technological edge that could translate into strategic advantage. The test flight of the first ship equipped with Marcus's drive had taken place 2 weeks ago. Captain Amy Rodriguez commanded the exploration vessel Pathfinder, a sleek ship designed specifically for long-range missions into unknown space. Amy had been chosen for her combination of diplomatic skill and military experience because the Pathfinder's mission was not just exploration, but also first contact with species that existed beyond Council space. The Council controlled access to the known galaxy, but there were hundreds of unexplored star systems in the regions they considered too remote or unimportant to bother with. Humanity intended to find out what was out there. The Pathfinder's first contact came in a system 40 light-years beyond the quarantine zone, farther than any human ship had traveled before. The planet was home to the Krell, an insectoid species that lived in vast underground hive cities and had achieved spaceflight, but never faster than light travel. Amy approached the first contact carefully, broadcasting messages in multiple formats and waiting for a response before entering orbit. When the Krell finally answered, their message was cautious but curious. They had detected human ships passing through their region and wondered what kind of species humanity was. The negotiations took 3 weeks of patient communication, with Amy learning the basics of Krell language and culture while explaining humanity's situation. When she mentioned the Council and the Banishment, something changed in the Krell responses. Their translator, a Krell named Clickspeaker in human terms, explained that his people knew about the Council and hated them. Centuries ago, the Council had made contact with the Krell and demanded tribute and obedience. When the Krell refused, unable to pay the fees or meet the requirements the Council imposed, they were declared a primitive species and forbidden from advancing. Council ships had destroyed Krell spacecraft and orbital facilities, forcing them back to their planet and keeping them there through periodic enforcement visits. Amy realized she had found something valuable beyond just a new species to talk to. The Krell had been victims of the same Council arrogance and control that had targeted humanity, and they had spent centuries nursing their resentment while building in secret. Clickspeaker took Amy to see hidden facilities where the Krell had been developing weapons and ships underground, preparing for the day when they might break free from Council restrictions. The technology was crude compared to human standards, but the determination was familiar. Amy proposed an alliance. Humanity would share technology and help the Krell achieve true spaceflight capability, and in return the Krell would join what she called the human domain as equal partners. Clickspeaker brought the proposal to the Krell Council of Hives, and after long deliberation they agreed. The Krell would be humanity's first ally, proof that the human domain was not just about human survival, but about creating an alternative to Council tyranny. Back in human space, trader Eric Stone had built a different kind of network. Eric operated on the edges of legality, running a small ship that crossed into Council space through rarely patrolled routes and made contact with dissidents, smugglers, and anyone else who had reason to resent Council control. He traded human goods, especially entertainment media and consumer technology, for information and occasionally for refugees who wanted to escape to human space. The Council had banned all human products, which naturally made them incredibly popular among younger species who saw human culture as exotic and rebellious. Eric's network had grown beyond his expectations. He now coordinated with dozens of other human traders who operated similar operations, and together, they had created underground markets on 17 different worlds. The trade was technically illegal, but Council enforcement was inconsistent and often corrupt. Eric paid bribes to officials who looked the other way, and he cultivated relationships with local revolutionaries who protected his operations in exchange for weapons and technology. The intelligence he gathered about Council politics and military movements was invaluable to human strategic planning. Senator Nina Parker continued to raise concerns about the direction humanity was taking. She argued in the Earth Coalition Parliament that the human domain was becoming militaristic and authoritarian, that the focus on weapons and expansion was corrupting human values. She pointed to incidents where human ships had violated Council territory without proper authorization, where traders like Eric Stone operated with military protection, despite engaging in illegal activities, and where dissenting voices within human space were being marginalized. President Carter, now serving her third term after the emergency provisions that suspended normal election cycles, responded that security required difficult choices. The Council had proven they would use force against humanity if given the chance, and only strength would guarantee human survival. The debate reflected a deeper tension within the human domain. Some people wanted to recreate the democratic and open society that had existed before the banishment, while others argued that humanity was essentially at war and needed centralized control to survive. Claire Nelson found herself navigating these tensions constantly in her role as director of the Bastion. She implemented transparency measures to prevent abuse, while also maintaining the security protocols that military operations required. It was an exhausting balance, but she believed it was necessary to preserve what made humanity worth defending. The completion of the first truly human-designed warship marked another milestone in the Domain's development. The Defiance was unlike anything the Council had seen, incorporating Marcus's new drives, advanced weapons systems based on directed energy rather than projectiles, and defensive shields that could disperse incoming fire across multiple frequency ranges. Lisa Morgan took command of the Defiance with a crew of 300, all volunteers who had trained specifically for this ship. The launch ceremony was broadcast across human space, and Admiral Coleman gave a speech declaring that humanity now had the tools to defend itself against any threat. But human intelligence suggested the Council had noticed the rapid advancement. Kevin Walsh, now a colonel in charge of all intelligence operations, reported increased surveillance activities near the quarantine zone boundaries. Council ships were probing human defenses more frequently, and communications intercepts suggested heated debates within the Council about what to do about humanity. The Thren advocated for military action before humans grew too strong, while other species counseled patience or even reconsideration of the banishment. The situation was unstable, and Walsh believed conflict was inevitable within the next 2 years. Jacob Hayes had successfully resettled the millions of evacuated colonists, though it had required building entirely new cities on the 7 permitted worlds and constructing dozens of orbital habitats. The refugees had adapted better than expected, many of them joining Project Dominion efforts or enlisting in the expanding military. Greg Sullivan had started a new farm on one of the inner worlds, and his son Danny was now 13 and talking about joining the exploration service when he turned 18. The displacement and loss had scarred a generation, but it had also created a population that was united by shared trauma and determination to never be powerless. Again, Captain Amy Rodriguez returned from Krell, space with ClickSpeaker and a delegation of Krell leaders who wanted to see the human domain for themselves. Their visit to the Bastion amazed them, and ClickSpeaker told Claire Nelson that his people had spent 300 years dreaming of freedom from Council control, but never imagining they could achieve it. Now partnered with humanity, that dream was becoming real. The Krell committed to the Alliance fully, offering their worlds as bases for human operations and their warriors as soldiers in the growing resistance to Council authority. The human domain was no longer just human. It was becoming something larger, an alternative vision for how species could interact based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy and control. Claire stood on the observation deck as a Krell transport ship docked at the Bastion for the first time, and she felt pride mixed with concern. Everything humanity had built was impressive, but it also made them a target. The Council would not ignore this challenge to their authority forever, and when they responded, the human domain would face its greatest test. The mining station on the edge of human territory was a small operation, just 50 workers extracting rare minerals from an asteroid field that technically fell within the quarantine zone boundaries. Mining supervisor Rick Palmer was reviewing the day's extraction reports when the alarm started screaming. His first thought was equipment failure or maybe a collision with debris. But then he saw the sensor readings and his blood went cold. 3 Thren warships had just emerged from faster-than-light travel less than 10,000 kilometers away, and they were powering weapons. Rick hit the emergency broadcast button and shouted for everyone to get to the escape pods. The miners scrambled from their workstations, many of them still in their pressure suits from external work shifts, and ran for the evacuation points. The station had 6 pods, each capable of holding 10 people in uncomfortable proximity, and Rick counted heads as people dove through the hatches. 48 workers made it into the pods before the first Thren weapons fire hit the station. The blast tore through the habitat section and vaporized the communications array, and suddenly Rick could not reach the 2 miners who had been working on the far end of the facility. The pods launched automatically, chemical rockets pushing them away from the dying station as fast as physics would allow. Rick watched through the small viewport as the Thren ships methodically destroyed everything humans had built on the asteroid. The attack was efficient and brutal, leaving nothing but debris and expanding clouds of frozen atmosphere. The pod's emergency beacons were broadcasting, but help was hours away at best. Rick held onto the safety harness and prayed that the Thren would not bother hunting down the escape pods. The attack became a rallying cry across human space within hours. Admiral Frank Coleman stood in the command center and watched the recordings that had been salvaged from the escape pod's external cameras. The Thren had not just destroyed the mining station, they had deliberately targeted it despite clear evidence that it was within human territory. This was not a border dispute or a misunderstanding. It was a provocation designed to test human resolve and provide an excuse for further aggression. Colonel Kevin Walsh briefed the Admiral on what his intelligence network had uncovered. Thren warlord Kreth, the military leader who had orchestrated humanity's banishment 5 years earlier, had been arguing within the Council for immediate military action against the human domain. Most Council species were hesitant, concerned about the cost and uncertain about human military capabilities, but Kreth had apparently decided to force the issue by launching an unauthorized attack. If humanity responded with force, Kreth could claim they were the aggressors and rally the Council to his position. If humanity did nothing, Kreth would argue they were weak and ripe for conquest. President Helen Carter convened an emergency meeting with her military and civilian advisors. The room was tense with anger and fear as everyone processed what the Thren attack meant. Senator Nina Parker argued for a measured response, perhaps filing a formal complaint with the Council and seeking allies among the more reasonable species. But Admiral Coleman dismissed that suggestion immediately. The Council had already shown they would not act fairly toward humanity, and appealing to them would only make humans look weak. The time for diplomacy had passed the moment Thren ships opened fire on human civilians. The Admiral proposed full military mobilization. Every ship in the human fleet would be activated. Reserves would be called up and the domain would prepare for total war. President Carter asked how long they had before the Thren could assemble a major invasion force, and Coleman estimated perhaps 3 months. The Thren would need time to convince other Council species to join them and to move ships into position. That gave humanity 90 days to prepare for the fight that would determine their future. Lisa Morgan received her orders while the Defiance was on patrol near the Krell homeworld. She was to return to the Bastion immediately and take command of the 1st Battle Group, a formation of 12 ships including the Defiance that would serve as humanity's primary offensive force. Lisa had trained for this possibility since taking command 2 years ago, but she had hoped it would never come. War with the Council meant casualties on a scale humanity had not experienced since the conflicts of the 21st century. And even victory would come at a terrible cost. Lieutenant Chris Martinez was 24 years old and had never seen actual combat, but he commanded the experimental fighter squadron that operated from the Defiance's launch bays. His 12 pilots flew small, single-person craft equipped with the most advanced systems human engineers could design. The fighters used AI assistants to handle navigation and targeting, leaving the pilots free to focus on tactics and strategy. Chris and his people had spent countless hours in simulations, but everyone knew that real combat would be different in ways they could not predict. The Council response to the Thren attack was exactly what Kevin Walsh had predicted. Warlord Kreth appeared before the Council and claimed that the mining station had been in disputed territory and that humanity had fired first. He showed fabricated evidence and passionate testimony from Thren witnesses, all of it lies but presented convincingly enough that several Council species expressed support. The Council voted to authorize a peacekeeping mission to enforce the quarantine zone boundaries and prevent further human aggression. What that meant in practical terms was that the Council would assemble an invasion armada to crush the human domain, once and for all. The assembly point for the Council fleet was in a system 2 weeks' travel from human space. Kevin Walsh's spy network tracked ships arriving from dozens of different species, each one bringing weapons and warriors to the coming battle. The Thren contributed the largest force, over 200 warships of various classes, but the Vaxil added another 100, and the Korthan brought 50 more. Other species sent smaller contingents, and the total count reached nearly 500 ships, the largest military force ever assembled in known galactic history. Admiral Coleman stood before the gathered officers and crew of the human fleet and delivered the speech that would be remembered for generations. He spoke about how humanity had been judged unfairly, banished without cause, and now faced extinction because older species feared human potential. He reminded everyone that humans had always been at their best when facing impossible odds, that adversity revealed character rather than creating it, and that the freedom to determine their own destiny was worth any sacrifice. His words were broadcast across human space and to the Krell worlds, and millions of people listened and found courage in his certainty. Engineer Laura Bennett worked around the clock to complete the final pieces of humanity's defensive strategy. The Bastion and the 7 human worlds were now protected by a network of automated platforms that could engage enemy ships without risking human lives. These platforms used the same advanced weapons as human ships but operated through coordinated AI systems that Marcus Webb had helped design. The platforms could not think creatively like human commanders, but they could execute predetermined defensive patterns with perfect precision and without fear or hesitation. Marcus himself was putting finishing touches on humanity's ultimate deterrent, a system he had been developing in secret for 3 years. The gravity well generators could create artificial gravitational fields strong enough to trap ships and prevent them from entering or leaving faster than light travel. If deployed correctly, they could turn the space around human worlds into a cage that Council ships could enter but not escape. Marcus explained the system to Admiral Coleman and President Carter, and both of them understood that this technology could be the difference between survival and annihilation. Captain Daniel Cross, who had spent 5 years overseeing logistics and support operations, received a combat command for the first time in his career. He would lead the 2nd Battle Group, a formation of older ships that were less advanced than the Defiance and her sisters, but still capable of inflicting serious damage. Daniel's orders were to protect the outer colonies and engage any Council forces that tried to bypass the main fleet. He knew his group would be outnumbered and outgunned, but he also knew that every Council ship his people destroyed was one less ship that could threaten Earth or the core worlds. Greg Sullivan stood in his fields and watched his son, Danny, pack a bag for the military transport that would take him to basic training. The boy had turned 18 2 months ago and enlisted immediately despite his mother Kate's tears and protests. Greg understood why Danny felt compelled to serve, because the same anger that had burned in Greg's heart when they were forced to abandon New Haven now burned in his son. This war was personal for everyone who had been displaced and humiliated by the Council's decree, and Danny wanted to be part of ensuring it never happened again. The Council fleet began its final approach toward human space exactly 93 days after the mining station attack. 500 ships moving in formation was a sight that should have inspired awe and terror, and Warlord Kreth expected humanity to surrender or at least attempt negotiations. Instead, the Council sensors detected human ships moving to intercept positions, and they received a simple message from Admiral Coleman stating that any Council vessel that entered the human domain would be destroyed. Kreth laughed at the audacity and gave the order to proceed at full speed. Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the Council fleet grow larger on the tactical displays. Her battle group was positioned directly in their path, 12 human ships against 500 alien ones, and anyone looking at the odds would have called it suicide. But Lisa remembered something Jacob Hayes had told her years ago after the banishment vote, that humanity's greatest strength was refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. She opened a channel to her entire fleet and gave the order that would start the battle. All ships were to engage at will, trust in their training and technology, and show the Council what humans could do when fighting for their survival. The Battle of the Bastion began with a move that confused every Council commander in the invasion fleet. Instead of forming a defensive line around human worlds, Lisa Morgan's ship scattered in 12 different directions and accelerated to speeds the Council sensors said should be impossible. The Defiance led one group of human vessels on a trajectory that looked like a retreat and war. Lord Kreth ordered a full pursuit, eager to crush the human flagship and break human morale. His formation of 60 Thren ships followed, leaving the main Council fleet behind as they chased what they thought was easy prey. Lisa waited until the Thren ships were fully committed to the pursuit before she gave the order to reverse course. The human ships flipped end over end in maneuvers that should have torn them apart with gravitational forces, but the inertial dampeners Marcus Webb had designed handled the stress easily. Suddenly the hunters became the hunted as 12 human ships came screaming back toward 60 Thren vessels with all weapons firing. The directed energy beams that the Defiance mounted cut through Thren shields like they were paper, and the first 3 enemy ships exploded before their commanders understood what was happening. Lieutenant Chris Martinez launched with his fighter squadron At the moment the Defiance opened fire. His 12 small craft were fast and maneuverable in ways that capital ships could not match, and they dove into the Thren formation like predators attacking a herd. The AI-assisted targeting systems marked enemy weak points, and Chris's pilot struck with precision that seemed superhuman. Within 5 minutes, 10 more Thren ships were either destroyed or crippled, and the enemy formation was breaking apart in confusion. The same pattern repeated across the battlefield as other human battle groups executed similar tactics against isolated council formations. The council fleet had numbers, but human ships had speed and weapons that outmatched anything the aliens possessed. Captain Daniel Cross led his older vessels in hit-and-run attacks against Vaxil contingents, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to concentrate fire. His ships took damage and 2 were destroyed in the opening hour of battle, but they eliminated 15 enemy vessels in return. Admiral Coleman watched the battle unfold from the command center on the Bastion and felt grim satisfaction as his tactics proved effective. The Council had expected a straightforward fight where their numerical advantage would be decisive, but humans had studied their enemy and found weaknesses to exploit. Council species had grown complacent over centuries of dominance, relying on overwhelming force rather than innovation, and now the complacency was costing them dearly. But Coleman also knew the battle was far from won. 500 ships could absorb heavy losses and still have enough strength to overwhelm human defenses if they fought smart. Warlord Kreth realized his mistake and ordered the scattered council formations to regroup into a single massive fleet. The maneuver took precious time and cost more ships as human vessels attacked the stragglers, but eventually the surviving council forces formed a coherent line and began their advance toward the Bastion. Kreth had lost nearly 100 ships in the opening engagement, but still commanded 400, and he intended to use them to crush the human station and everything it represented. That was when Marcus Webb activated the gravity well generators. The system powered up around the Bastion and the inner human worlds, creating invisible fields that pulled at spacetime itself. Council ships that had been preparing to jump to faster than light speeds found their drives failing, and those that tried anyway had their ships torn apart by competing gravitational forces. The Council fleet was trapped in normal space, unable to retreat or maneuver as they had planned, forced to fight on human terms. The realization spread through the Council fleet like a virus. Their commanders understood that they were caught in a trap, with an enemy that had proven more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Some captains wanted to withdraw immediately, willing to abandon their ships and crews in escape pods rather than face annihilation. Others argued for pressing the attack, believing that sheer numbers would still prevail. Warlord Kreth ordered the fleet forward, threatening to execute any captain who showed cowardice, and the massive formation began its final approach to the Bastion. Lisa Morgan regrouped her battle group and positioned them directly between the Council fleet and the human station. Her ships were battered and 2 had been destroyed, but the survivors were ready for the next phase of the battle. She opened a channel to all human forces and reminded them what they were fighting for: the right to exist without asking permission from species that saw them as inferiors, the freedom to build their own future, and the memory of everyone who had suffered because of Council arrogance. Her words were simple, but they resonated with every human warrior in the fleet. The automated defense platforms that engineer Laura Bennett had deployed came online as the Council fleet entered their range. Thousands of weapons began firing in coordinated patterns, creating a web of destruction that Council ships had to navigate while also fighting human vessels. The platforms could not adapt or improvise, but they did not need to because Laura had programmed them with scenarios covering every possible Council approach. The enemy fleet started, taking losses from all sides as platforms and human ships worked together with deadly efficiency. Warlord Kreth made his final gamble in order to suicide run. Directly at Earth, he took his personal ship and 30 of the largest Thren vessels and punched through the human defensive line, accepting catastrophic damage in exchange for a straight shot at humanity's homeworld. If he could destroy Earth or even just strike its major cities, the psychological damage might break human resistance even if the Thren ships were all lost. His formation blasted through human defenses, leaving destroyed ships in their wake, and accelerated toward the blue planet that hung in space ahead. Captain Daniel Cross saw what Kreth was attempting and made a decision that he knew would cost him everything. His ship, the Sanctuary, was already badly damaged from hours of combat, systems failing and hull breaches on multiple decks. But the engines still worked, and the ship could still move. Daniel ordered his crew to evacuate in escape pods, and then programmed the Sanctuary for a collision course with Kreth's flagship. The automated systems protested that such a maneuver would destroy the ship, but Daniel overrode them and locked in the course. The Sanctuary hit Kreth's vessel at a significant fraction of light speed, and both ships ceased to exist in a flash of energy that was visible from Earth's surface. The explosion and debris caught 2 more Thren ships and damaged several others, and suddenly the suicide run fell apart as the surviving vessels found themselves leaderless and under attack from human fighters. Lieutenant Chris Martinez and his squadron swept in and finished what Daniel had started, destroying the remaining Thren ships before they could threaten Earth. The death of Warlord Kreth broke the Council fleet's will to fight. Without their most aggressive leader and with losses approaching 60%, the surviving Council ships attempted to surrender. Admiral Coleman accepted on the condition that all Council forces would withdraw immediately from human space, and that formal peace negotiations would begin within 30 days. The Council commanders agreed, desperate to save what remained of their fleet and their lives. The Battle of the Bastion was over after 8 hours of continuous fighting. Humanity had lost 40 ships and thousands of warriors, including heroes like Daniel Cross, but they had defeated the largest military force ever assembled against them. The victory was costly but complete, and news of it spread across the galaxy faster than light as traders and spies carried the story to every corner of known space. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral space station built specifically for the purpose. Jacob Hayes represented humanity alongside Admiral Coleman and President Carter, facing Council representatives who looked diminished and uncertain. The terms humanity demanded were simple but revolutionary. The quarantine zone was abolished and human ships would have access to all of known space. Humanity would be recognized as a sovereign power with full rights and representation. Species that had been oppressed or controlled by the Council would be granted independence if they wished it. The Thren would lose their dominant position and be subject to oversight to prevent future aggress. Scion, the Council had no choice but to accept. Their military had been shattered and their authority was crumbling as subject species heard about the human victory and began demanding their own freedom. The old order that had ruled the galaxy for millennia was dying, and everyone present knew that whatever emerged to replace it would be shaped by human ideals and human strength. 1 year after the battle, Claire Nelson stood on the observation deck of the Bastion and marveled at how much had changed. The station had been repaired and expanded, and now ships from a dozen species docked at its ports every day. The Free Species Alliance that President Carter had proposed was becoming reality, with 23 species joining voluntarily, and more applying for membership every month. The alliance operated on principles of equality and consent rather than hierarchy and force, and it represented everything the Council had never been. Lisa Morgan had survived the battle and now commanded the Alliance Defense Fleet, training officers from multiple species in the tactics that had won humanity's freedom. Lieutenant Chris Martinez, promoted to captain after his heroism in battle, led the fighter training program. Greg Sullivan's son Danny had served with distinction during the battle and was now studying at the Alliance Military Academy. Kate Sullivan had been horrified by how close they came to losing their son, but also fiercely proud of what he had accomplished. The Krell prospered under their alliance with humanity, their worlds becoming major manufacturing centers, and their warriors earning respect throughout the alliance. Click Speaker served as the Krell ambassador to humanity and became close friends with Jacob Hayes, the two of them often joking about how they represented species that the Council had tried to suppress, but that had thrived once given the chance. Senator Nina Parker had been right that war changed humanity, but not entirely in the way she feared. The human domain had become more militaristic and powerful, but it had also become more inclusive and principled. The experience of fighting for survival had taught humans the value of allies and the importance of standing against tyranny. President Carter worked to balance security needs with democratic values, and while the balance was imperfect, it was genuine. Captain Amy Rodriguez continued exploration missions, discovering new species and bringing them into the growing Alliance network. Many of these species had stories similar to the Krell, tales of Council oppression or neglect, and they found hope in what humanity offered. The galaxy was larger and more diverse than the Council had ever acknowledged, and humans were determined to explore it all. Marcus Webb and Laura Bennett continued pushing the boundaries of technology, but now they shared their discoveries with Alliance partners rather than hoarding them. The collaborative research produced breakthroughs that no single species could have achieved alone, and the Alliance technological level began to surpass anything the Council had developed in centuries of stagnation. The old Galactic Council still existed, but as a shadow of its former self. Several species had withdrawn entirely, while others remained but with reduced influence. The Thren were contained and monitored, their military reduced to defensive forces and their ambitions for dominance permanently curtailed. Some Council species approached the Alliance about joining, recognizing that the future belonged to cooperation rather than control. Lisa Morgan stood in a classroom at the Alliance Academy and spoke to a mixed group of cadets from 6 different species. She told them about the banishment and the long struggle that followed, about the sacrifices that had been made and the principles that had guided humanity through its darkest hours. She talked about heroes like Daniel Cross who gave everything so others could be free, and she challenged the cadets to remember that freedom was never guaranteed, that every generation had to defend it and expand it and pass it on to those who came after. The story of humanity's rise from banishment to leadership became the founding myth of the Free Species Alliance. It was taught in schools across dozens of worlds, translated into hundreds of languages and remembered in art and music and monuments. The lesson was clear. Those who tried to cage others revealed their own weakness, and those who fought for freedom could achieve anything.